Ma'am, I need to ask you to leave immediately, or I'm calling security. Those were the exact words the manager had said to me 15 years ago. And today, I repeated them back to him, watching his face drain of color as he realized who I was. The same man who had grabbed my arm and dragged me out of his restaurant when I was 12 years old, begging for scraps. The same man who was now looking at the purchase agreement in my hands, seeing his restaurant's fate sealed with my signature. You know what they say about karma. Sometimes it takes years to come full circle, but when it does, it arrives with interest. Sometimes the universe has a twisted sense of humor about justice. The people who kick you when you're down rarely expect you to rise up and become the one holding their future in your hands. Hey everyone, how are you doing today? I hope wherever you're watching this from, you're somewhere warm and comfortable. Maybe you've got a snack nearby, something you didn't have to beg for or worry about. The weather here has been beautiful lately, which feels fitting for what I'm about to share with you. My name is Lena Chen, and this is the story of how I went from a starving 12-year-old girl, literally on her knees begging for food, to the successful businesswoman who walked back into that same restaurant 15 years later with enough money to buy the entire building. I can still see the moment perfectly, me standing in that restaurant's doorway in my tailored suit, watching the same manager who had humiliated me realize that the poor little girl he'd thrown out was now his new boss. But before we dive into that sweet moment of justice, please hit that subscribe button if you enjoy stories about people who refuse to stay down when life knocks them over. And definitely stick around, because this story has twists that'll make you question everything you think you know about second chances and revenge. But let me start from the beginning. I was 12 years old, and I believed the world was fundamentally good. I believed that if you were hungry enough, if you asked politely enough, if you showed people you were desperate enough, someone would help you. I believed adults protected children, that restaurants had hearts, and that being honest about your situation would earn you compassion rather than cruelty. God, I was naive. I'd been living in foster care since I was 8, bouncing between homes that ranged from neglectful to downright abusive. The group home I was in that winter was overcrowded and underfunded. Meals were small and infrequent, and I'd learned to stretch whatever food we got as far as possible. But that particular Tuesday, I hadn't eaten in 2 days. The younger kids had gotten first dibs on the limited groceries, and I'd given my portion to a 6-year-old who was crying from hunger. By evening, I was dizzy and shaking. The group home was locked down for the night, but I'd figured out how to slip out through a basement window. I wandered the streets, hoping to find someone throwing away food, maybe a restaurant with leftovers they'd give to a polite, hungry kid. That's when I saw Romano's Family Restaurant. It was this warm, glowing place with big windows that let you see inside to families eating together, laughing, sharing plates of food that looked like more than I'd seen in weeks. The smell of garlic bread and pasta sauce hit me like a physical thing, making my empty stomach clench with desperate hope. I stood outside for probably 20 minutes, working up the courage to go in. I practiced what I'd say. How I'd explain that I was hungry and alone, but I was a good kid who just needed help. I'd offer to wash dishes or sweep floors in exchange for even just bread. I rehearsed being polite and grateful, the way adults always told us kids to be when we needed something. Finally, I pushed open that heavy glass door. The warmth hit me immediately, along with the incredible smell of real food being cooked with care. Families were scattered throughout the dining room, kids my age eating without thinking about it, parents serving them seconds without counting every bite. I approached the hostess stand where a teenage girl was organizing menus. She looked up at me, and I saw her expression change immediately. I was wearing clothes that had been donated to the group home, too big and clearly secondhand. My hair was tangled because the home only had cheap shampoo that made everything worse. I probably looked exactly like what I was, a kid with nowhere to go and no one taking care of her. "Hi," I said, trying to sound confident. "I'm really hungry, and I was wondering if maybe I could do some work in exchange for food? I could wash dishes or clean tables or anything you need." The hostess looked uncomfortable and glanced toward the back of the restaurant. Hold on a second, she said, and disappeared through a door marked staff only. I waited, trying not to stare at the plates of food being carried past me. A family at a nearby table had ordered more than they could eat, and I watched them push half a pizza aside, probably headed for the trash. My mouth was watering so badly I had to swallow constantly. That's when he appeared. Manager Frank DeLuca, though I wouldn't learn his name until much later. He was a large man with graying hair and the kind of authoritative voice that made it clear he was used to being obeyed without question. You need to leave, he said, not bothering with any greeting or attempt to understand my situation. Please, sir, I said, my voice already getting smaller. I'm just really hungry and I can work for food. I'm good at cleaning and I won't bother any of your customers. We don't give handouts, he said firmly. This is a business, not a charity. You're making our customers uncomfortable. I looked around desperately. A few people were glancing over, but they looked more curious than uncomfortable. I have a couple dollars, I lied, reaching into my empty pocket. Maybe I could buy just bread, or soup, or anything small? You don't have money, he said, his voice getting harder. I can tell just by looking at you. And even if you did, we don't serve people who look like they haven't bathed in weeks. The words hit me like slaps. I felt my face burning with shame, but I was too hungry and desperate to give up. Please, I just need something small. I haven't eaten in 2 days. That's not my problem, Frank said. You need to leave now or I'm calling the police. But I'm just hungry, I whispered, feeling tears starting to build. I'm not trying to cause trouble. You're trouble just by being here, he said, and then he did something I'll never forget. He grabbed my arm, his grip tight enough to leave bruises, and started dragging me toward the door. I'm not asking anymore. Get out and don't come back. I stumbled as he pulled me, my oversized shoes catching on the restaurant's thick carpet. Other customers were definitely staring now, some looking concerned, others looking away in embarrassment. A woman with 2 children started to stand up like she might say something, but her husband put a hand on her arm and shook his head. Frank shoved me out the front door hard enough that I stumbled and fell onto the sidewalk, scraping my palms on the concrete. If I see you around here again, I'm calling the cops, he shouted loud enough for people walking by to turn and stare. We don't want your kind here. The door slammed shut behind me, and I was alone on the cold sidewalk, more humiliated than I'd ever been in my life. Through the big windows, I could see families continuing their meals like nothing had happened. Like a hungry kid getting thrown out was just part of the evening's entertainment. I walked back to the group home that night with my stomach cramping from hunger and my heart breaking from something much worse. It wasn't just that I'd been refused food. It was the way Frank had looked at me like I was something disgusting, something that contaminated his clean, warm restaurant just by existing. It was the way he'd made it clear that people like me didn't deserve basic human kindness, that our desperation was offensive to people who had enough. But here's what Frank DeLuca didn't know that night as he watched me disappear into the darkness. That 12-year-old girl he'd thrown away like garbage was going to remember every single detail of that humiliation. She was going to use it as fuel for 15 years of working harder than anyone around her. She was going to build something from nothing, driven by the promise she made to herself on that cold sidewalk. I promised myself that someday I'd have enough power to walk back into Romano's family restaurant and Frank DeLuca would have to treat me with respect. I promised myself that I'd never again be the person who could be thrown away, ignored, or dismissed. What I didn't know then was that my revenge would be so much sweeter than I could have imagined. That night changed everything about how I saw the world, but it took years for me to understand what that really meant. I went back to the group home and didn't tell anyone what had happened. What was the point? The staff were overworked and barely managing to keep us fed and housed. They didn't have time for one kid's hurt feelings about being rejected by a restaurant. But I couldn't stop thinking about Frank DeLuca's face when he looked at me. The disgust, the immediate dismissal, like I was something that had crawled out from under a rock. I'd replay that moment over and over, especially when I was lying awake hungry, which was most nights. The group home where I lived housed 23 kids between the ages of 8 and 17. The building was old and constantly breaking down, with a heating system that worked sporadically and plumbing that backed up at least once a month. We had 3 counselors working rotating shifts, all of them burned out and underpaid. The food budget was stretched so thin that meals were mostly canned vegetables, cheap pasta, and whatever protein they could buy in bulk. Mrs. Rodriguez was the head counselor, and she was the closest thing to a parent figure I had. She'd been working in foster care for 12 years and had this way of seeing potential in kids that everyone else had written off. She noticed that I'd started hoarding food after the Romanos incident, hiding pieces of bread and crackers under my mattress. "Lena, honey, you don't need to save food," she told me one evening when she found my stash during a routine room check. "There'll be breakfast tomorrow, and lunch, and dinner." "You don't know that," I said, which probably sounded paranoid to her. But I'd learned that adults made promises about food and safety that they couldn't always keep. Mrs. Rodriguez sat down on my thin mattress and looked at me seriously. "What happened to make you so scared about food?" I told her about Romanos, about Frank, about feeling like I was worthless because I couldn't afford to eat. She listened without interrupting, her face getting sadder with each detail. "Lena," she said when I finished, "that man was wrong. Being hungry doesn't make you less valuable as a person. Having money doesn't make you more worthy of kindness. But it makes you safer," I said. "Rich people don't get thrown out of restaurants." She couldn't argue with that, because it was true. Money was protection. Money was power. Money was the difference between being Frank DeLuca's victim and being someone he had to respect. "You're smart," Mrs. Rodriguez said. "Smarter than most of the kids I work with. If you focus that intelligence on building something for yourself instead of just surviving day to day, you could change your whole life." That conversation planted a seed that would grow into everything I became. Mrs. Rodriguez started bringing me books about business, about people who'd built successful companies from nothing. She showed me stories of entrepreneurs who'd grown up poor and hungry, but had refused to let that define their entire lives. I read every single book she gave me, usually by flashlight after lights out, because I was so hungry for knowledge about how money actually worked. How businesses started, how they grew, how people went from having nothing to having enough to never worry about food again. When I turned 14, I got my first job at a small grocery store in our neighborhood. It was technically illegal since I was under 15, but the owner, Mr. Park, paid me cash to stock shelves and clean the store after school. $3 an hour, which felt like a fortune to someone who'd never had any money at all. Mr. Park was a Korean immigrant who'd opened his store with savings from 20 years of working in other people's businesses. He worked 7 days a week, 16 hours a day, and lived in a tiny apartment above the store. But he owned something. He'd built something that was his. Success is not accident, he told me in his careful English while we restocked the produce section. Success is choice. Every day, you choose to work or you choose to give up. Most people give up. I started watching how Mr. Park ran his business. How he decided what to order, how he priced things, how he dealt with difficult customers. He taught me to think about profit margins and customer service, about the difference between working hard and working smart. "You very smart girl," he said after I'd been working there for 6 months. "But smart is not enough. You need to want success more than you want anything else. More than you want to be comfortable. More than you want people to like you." The money I earned at Mr. Park's store went toward 2 things. First, I bought myself enough food that I never had to go hungry again. Real food, not just cheap carbohydrates, but protein and vegetables and fruit. I'd learned that being constantly hungry made it impossible to think clearly or study effectively. Second, I saved everything else. Mrs. Rodriguez helped me open a bank account when I turned 15, and I deposited every dollar I didn't spend on necessities. Watching that balance grow gave me a feeling of security I'd never experienced before. But working at the grocery store also taught me something important about the food industry. I noticed how much people spent on groceries without thinking about it, how they'd pay premium prices for products that were only slightly different from cheaper alternatives. I started understanding that food wasn't just about nutrition. It was about comfort, status, identity. When I turned 16, I aged out of foster care. Most kids in my situation ended up homeless or in minimum wage jobs with no advancement opportunities. But Mrs. Rodriguez had helped me apply for every scholarship and grant available to former foster kids. I'd kept my grades high despite everything else going on, and I'd written scholarship essays about overcoming adversity that apparently impressed the right people. I got accepted to the state university with enough financial aid to cover tuition and a dorm room. It wasn't a fancy school, but it was a real college education, which was more than most kids from my background ever got. The night before I left for college, Mrs. Rodriguez gave me an envelope with $500 in cash. "This is from my own savings," she said when I tried to refuse it. "Use it for emergencies or textbooks or whatever you need to succeed. I'll pay you back, I promised." "Pay it forward instead," she said. "Someday when you're successful, help another kid who's where you are now." College was harder than I'd expected, not academically, but socially. Most of my classmates came from families with money, families who sent care packages and paid for spring break trips. They talked about summer internships at their parents' companies and job connections through family friends. They had safety nets I couldn't even imagine. I worked 3 jobs while taking a full course load. I cleaned office buildings at night, worked in the campus dining hall during lunch hours, and tutored younger students for extra cash. I was exhausted constantly, but I was also learning skills that my classmates weren't getting in their business classes. During my sophomore year, I got a job working weekends at a small restaurant near campus. It was nothing like Romano's, just a family-owned place that served simple comfort food to college students and local families. But working there taught me how restaurants actually operated, from inventory management to customer service to profit margins. The owner, Maria Santos, was a single mother who'd started the restaurant after her divorce, using her grandmother's recipes and a loan from her church. She worked every single shift herself, sometimes going days without a break when employees called in sick. "The restaurant business will break you if you let it," Maria told me while we prepped vegetables for the dinner rush. "Tiny profit margins, huge overhead, customers who think they're experts because they eat food. But if you can make it work, if you can build something people love, it's the most rewarding thing in the world." I started paying attention to which menu items had the highest profit margins, which suppliers gave the best deals, how Maria handled difficult customers and demanding vendors. I learned about food costs and labor costs and how a restaurant could be packed with customers but still lose money if the operations weren't managed correctly. Maria started giving me more responsibility, letting me handle inventory orders and even experimenting with new menu items. She treated me like a business partner rather than just hired help, which was completely different from any job I'd had before. "You have instincts for this," she said after I'd suggested a modification to her most popular dish that ended up increasing its profit margin by 30%. "You understand that running a restaurant is about more than just cooking food. It's about creating an experience that people will pay for." But my relationship with Maria also taught me a painful lesson about trust and loyalty in business. During my junior year, she started having serious financial problems. The restaurant was popular but not profitable enough to cover her increasing costs, and she was months behind on rent and supplier payments. "I might have to close," she told me one evening after we'd finished cleaning up from a busy dinner service. "I can't make the numbers work anymore." I'd saved $15,000 by that point, money I'd planned to use for graduate school or starting my own business someday. But Maria had been good to me, had taught me everything I knew about the food industry, had treated me like family when I had nowhere else to go. "I could lend you the money," I offered, "to help you catch up on the rent and get current with suppliers." Maria's face lit up with relief and gratitude. "Lena, that would save everything. I promise I'll pay you back with interest as soon as business picks up." I gave her $12,000, keeping just enough in my account to avoid overdraft fees. Maria used the money to pay her most urgent debts and keep the restaurant operating. For 2 months, things seemed to be improving. Then I found out she'd been lying to me about almost everything. One evening, I arrived at work to find Maria loading boxes of kitchen equipment into a rental truck. She looked shocked and guilty when she saw me, like she'd hoped to be gone before I showed up. "What's happening?" I asked, though the sick feeling in my stomach already knew. "I'm sorry, Lena," she said, not meeting my eyes. "I have to close the restaurant. I found a buyer for the equipment, and I'm moving back to California to stay with my sister." "What about my money?" I asked. "The $12,000 I lent you. I'll pay you back as soon as I can," she said, but we both knew she never would. "I'm sorry. I never meant for things to turn out this way." She finished loading the truck and drove away that night, leaving me standing in an empty restaurant with the knowledge that I'd just lost almost every dollar I'd saved in 3 years of working multiple jobs. But here's what Maria Santos didn't realize when she drove away with my money and my trust. She'd just taught me the most valuable lesson I'd ever learn about business. Never trust anyone with your financial security. Never give people more power over your future than you can afford to lose. And never, ever let emotions override smart business decisions. I stood in that empty restaurant, feeling like that 12-year-old girl outside Romano's all over again, powerless and betrayed by an adult I'd trusted. But this time, I had something I didn't have before. I had knowledge, I had skills, and I had a burning determination to never let anyone else control my financial destiny. I also had something else. I had a very clear understanding of exactly what kind of restaurant I would build someday, and exactly how I would run it differently than anyone who had ever betrayed me. The food industry had just become personal. Losing that $12,000 to Maria should have broken me. 3 years of working myself to exhaustion, living on ramen noodles and generic cereal, sleeping 4 hours a night so I could work and study and save every possible dollar. Gone because I'd trusted someone who told me pretty lies about family and loyalty and paying me back someday. But instead of breaking me, it clarified everything. I was done depending on other people's promises. I was done working for people who could take away my security whenever they felt like it. I was done being the person who could be discarded and forgotten. I was going to build something that belonged entirely to me. The problem was that I had $3,000 left to my name, a semester and a half left of college, and absolutely no idea how to start a food business with basically no capital. Most people would have said it was impossible, that I should focus on finishing school and finding a stable job with a steady paycheck. But I kept thinking about something Mr. Park had told me years earlier. People think they need permission to start business. They wait for perfect time, perfect amount of money, perfect plan. Perfect never comes. You start with what you have. What I had was knowledge about food costs and profit margins that most college students didn't possess. I had experience with inventory management and customer service. I had a work ethic that could outlast anyone. And I had something else that was maybe more valuable than money. I had genuine hunger. Not just for food, but for success. For security. For the power to never be vulnerable again. I started small, smaller than anyone would have believed could lead to anything significant. I began making homemade energy bars in my dorm room kitchen, using a recipe I developed by experimenting with bulk ingredients I could buy cheaply. Oats, honey, peanut butter, protein powder, dried fruit. Simple ingredients that I could turn into something that tasted better and cost less than anything you could buy in stores. My roommate Jennifer thought I'd lost my mind when she found me up at 2 in the morning, making batch after batch of energy bars and wrapping them individually in plastic wrap. "Lena, what are you doing?" she asked, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Starting a business," I said, not looking up from the assembly line I'd created on our tiny counter. "In our dorm room?" "It's where I live," I said. "It's what I can afford." Jennifer was one of those people who'd grown up with money, whose parents sent her care packages and paid her credit card bills without asking questions. She didn't understand what it felt like to know that your entire future depended on what you could build with your own hands. But don't you want to finish college first? Get a real job. This is real, I said. And college doesn't teach you how to actually start something from nothing. The next morning, I loaded my backpack with 50 energy bars and walked around campus, selling them to students for $2 each. It had cost me about 60 cents per bar to make them, which meant I was making a profit margin that would make any food company jealous. Within a week, I had regular customers. Students who worked out at the campus gym started buying bars from me every few days. People studying late in the library would seek me out because my bars actually kept them full longer than vending machine snacks. But it was when I started selling to the campus coffee shop that everything changed. The manager, David Kim, was a recent graduate who'd stayed in town to run his family's small chain of coffee shops near the university. He was probably 25, with this intense energy and clear vision for expanding the business beyond just coffee. "These are really good," he said after trying one of my bars. "Way better than the packaged stuff we sell now. How many can you make? How many do you want?" I asked, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Let's start with 100 per week and see how they sell." 100 bars per week meant I'd need to completely reorganize my production process, find a bigger kitchen space, and probably get some kind of business license. It meant turning my dorm room experiment into something that looked like an actual company. "I can do 100, I said. "But I'll need to charge you $1.50 each to make it worth the volume." David agreed immediately, which told me I probably could have asked for more. But $150 per week felt like a fortune to someone who'd been counting every dollar for years. That night, I called Mrs. Rodriguez to tell her about my first real business deal. "I'm proud of you," she said. "But be careful. Growing too fast can kill a business just as quickly as growing too slow." "I'm being careful," I promised. "I'm only committing to what I know I can deliver." But within a month, David was asking for 200 bars per week. Then 300. His customers loved them, and he was selling out every few days. Other coffee shops near campus started asking if they could carry them too. I was making more money from my energy bars than I was from all my other jobs combined, and I was doing it by creating something instead of just trading my time for wages. For the first time in my life, I could see a path to real financial security. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. I decided to drop out of college and focus on building the business full-time. Everyone thought I was making a huge mistake. My professors warned me about giving up my degree when I was so close to graduating. My few friends told me I was throwing away my future for a business that might fail in 6 months. Even Mrs. Rodriguez, who had always supported my ambitions, was worried. "Education is the one thing no one can take away from you," she said during one of our phone calls. "You can always start a business later, but finishing college gives you a safety net." "I don't want a safety net," I said. "Safety nets make you comfortable with not taking risks. I want to build something so successful that I don't need anyone else's backup plan." The truth was, I was terrified. Dropping out of college felt like jumping off a cliff with no guarantee that I'd figure out how to fly on the way down. But I was more terrified of staying safe, of settling for someone else's version of success, of spending the next 40 years working for people who could fire me whenever they wanted. I used the last of my savings to rent a small commercial kitchen space that I could use during off hours when the main tenant wasn't operating. It was in a run-down part of town, with equipment that was older than I was, but it had the permits and licenses I needed to legally produce food for sale. Working in that kitchen at 3 in the morning, making batch after batch of energy bars with my own hands, I felt more alive than I'd ever felt sitting in a lecture hall. This was mine. Every ingredient I bought, every bar I made, every customer I gained was proof that I could build something valuable from nothing. Within 6 months, I was supplying 12 coffee shops and 3 gyms around the city. I'd hired 2 part-time employees to help with production, and I was making enough money to pay my rent, buy ingredients, and even save a little for expansion. But success brought new problems I hadn't anticipated. Bigger orders meant I needed more working capital to buy ingredients in bulk. More customers meant I needed better packaging and more reliable delivery schedules. More production meant I needed better equipment and more kitchen space. Everything that made the business grow also made it more expensive to operate. I was making more money than I'd ever seen, but I was also spending more money than I'd ever imagined. The gap between success and failure felt thinner than ever. That's when I met the person who would become both my biggest opportunity and my greatest risk. Marcus Webb was a successful businessman in his 40s who owned several restaurants and had investments in a dozen other food companies. He'd heard about my energy bars from one of the coffee shops I supplied, and he wanted to meet to discuss a potential partnership. We met at an upscale restaurant downtown, the kind of place I'd never been able to afford as a customer. Marcus was polished and confident, with the easy manner of someone who'd never worried about money. He ordered expensive wine without looking at the price and talked about business deals like they were chess moves. "You've built something impressive," he said after I'd explained how I'd grown the business from my dorm room. "But you're thinking too small. Energy bars are a billion-dollar market, and you're competing against companies with massive marketing budgets and distribution networks." "I'm not trying to compete with everyone," I said. "I'm trying to build something sustainable." "Sustainable is another word for limited," Marcus said. "You have a product that could be national, maybe international. But you need serious capital to scale up production, get into major retail chains, build brand recognition." He outlined a vision that was both exciting and terrifying. With his backing, I could lease a real production facility, hire a proper staff, develop multiple product lines, get my bars into grocery stores across the region. I'd invest $500,000 in exchange for a 40% stake in the company, he said. "You keep majority control, but you get the resources to become a real player in the food industry." $500,000 was more money than I'd ever imagined having access to. It was enough to transform my small operation into a legitimate company that could compete with established brands. It was the difference between staying small and local forever and building something that could make me genuinely wealthy. But it also meant giving up part of my company to someone I barely knew. It meant having a partner who could influence my decisions, who would have legal rights to the business I'd built from nothing. "I need to think about it," I said. "Of course," Marcus replied. "But opportunities like this don't wait around forever. The food industry moves fast, and someone else is going to figure out what you figured out. The question is whether you want to be the leader or just another company trying to catch up." I spent the next week agonizing over the decision. The logical part of my brain knew that I probably couldn't grow much bigger without significant investment. I was already maxed out on the loans I qualified for, and I was working 20-hour days just to keep up with current demand. But the scared part of my brain remembered Maria Santos driving away with my money, remembered Frank DeLuca grabbing my arm and throwing me out of his restaurant. It remembered that trusting people with power over my security had never ended well. In the end, it was Mrs. Rodriguez who helped me make the decision. "What's the worst thing that could happen if you say yes?" she asked during one of our phone calls. "He could take control of my company and push me out," I said. "And what's the worst thing that could happen if you say no?" "I stay small forever and someone else builds the company I could have built. Which one can you live with?" I called Marcus the next morning and told him I was ready to move forward with the partnership. 2 weeks later, I signed papers that gave Marcus Webb 40% ownership of the company I'd built with my own hands. In exchange, I received the largest check I'd ever seen and the promise of resources that would let me compete with anyone in the industry. It felt like the most important moment of my life. I was finally going to have the capital and support to build something truly significant, something that could make me wealthy enough to never be powerless again. What I didn't know was that I'd just made the biggest mistake of my life, and that Marcus Webb's idea of partnership was very different from mine. The first sign that something was wrong came 3 weeks after signing the partnership agreement. Marcus had insisted we move production to a facility he owned across town, saying it would be more efficient and professional than the small commercial kitchen I'd been renting. The new space was impressive, gleaming stainless steel equipment, proper conveyor systems, enough room to triple our production capacity. But when I arrived Monday morning to oversee the transition, I found Marcus had hired an entirely new production team without consulting me. "I thought we discussed this," he said when I questioned him about it. "Your current employees don't have experience with large-scale food production. These people have worked in major facilities. They understand food safety regulations, quality control systems. You said we'd discuss major decisions together," I reminded him, trying to keep my voice calm. "Firing my entire staff is a major decision." "I didn't fire anyone," Marcus said with that easy smile that was starting to make me uncomfortable. "I simply chose not to retain them for the new operation. It's a business decision, not a personal one." But it felt personal to me. Sarah and Miguel had been with me from the beginning, had worked nights and weekends to help me fill orders when we were overwhelmed. They'd believed in what we were building together, and now they were being replaced by strangers who saw this as just another job. "At least let me give them severance pay," I said. "They deserve better than just being told their services are no longer needed." "That's your decision," Marcus said. "But remember that every dollar we spend on unnecessary expenses is a dollar that doesn't go toward growth." I paid Sarah and Miguel severance from my personal account, which left me with less cash than I'd had before the partnership. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd gained $500,000 in investment, but somehow felt financially tighter than before. The new production team was efficient, I had to admit. Within 2 weeks, we were producing more energy bars per day than I'd been able to make in a month working alone. The quality was consistent, the packaging looked professional, and our costs per unit had dropped significantly. But something felt wrong about walking through the facility and not recognizing anyone. These weren't people who cared about the company's success beyond their hourly wages. They didn't understand that every bar represented my dream of never being powerless again. The second sign came when Marcus announced he'd secured meetings with 3 major grocery store chains. "This is exactly what we needed," he said, showing me emails from buyers at regional supermarket companies. "They're interested in carrying our bars in over 200 stores. It would increase our revenue by at least 5 times. "That's incredible," I said, and it genuinely was. Getting into major retail was something I dreamed about but hadn't imagined happening so quickly. "There's just one small issue," Marcus continued. "They want some modifications to the product line. Different flavors, different packaging, some adjustments to the nutritional profile to match their target demographics." "What kind of adjustments?" Marcus pulled out a folder thick with market research and focus group data. "They want us to reduce the protein content slightly and increase the sugar content. Apparently, customers prefer sweeter bars even if they're technically less healthy. They also want brighter packaging and flavor names that are more appealing to impulse buyers." I stared at the research, feeling something cold settle in my stomach. "But the whole point of my bars is that they're actually healthy. That's why people buy them instead of candy bars." "People buy them because they taste good and make them feel full," Marcus corrected. "The health aspect is marketing. What matters is giving customers what they actually want, not what we think they should want." "But if we change the formula, we're not better than the products we're competing against anymore." "We're not trying to be better," Marcus said patiently, like he was explaining something obvious to a child. "We're trying to be more profitable. Better doesn't matter if it doesn't sell." The meetings with the grocery store buyers went exactly as Marcus had predicted. They loved the modified formulas, praised the new packaging designs, and offered us contracts that would transform the company overnight from a small local business to a regional brand. But sitting in those conference rooms, listening to Marcus negotiate terms and make promises about delivery schedules and marketing support, I felt like I was watching someone else's company being discussed. The buyers directed most of their questions to Marcus, even though I was sitting right there. When I tried to contribute to the conversation, they'd listen politely and then turn back to Marcus for the real answers. "You did great in there," Marcus said after the final meeting. "But maybe next time, let me handle the business negotiations and you focus on the product development side. That's where your expertise really shines." "Product development is business," I said. Every decision about the product affects profit margins, customer satisfaction, brand positioning. Of course it does, Marcus agreed. But these buyers are used to dealing with experienced business development people. They need to feel confident that we can deliver what we promise, and that confidence comes from working with people who speak their language. I wanted to argue, but the contracts he'd negotiated were genuinely impressive. Revenue projections that would make me more money in 6 months than I'd made in the previous 2 years. Market penetration that would establish us as a legitimate competitor to national brands. Maybe Marcus was right. Maybe I was letting my pride get in the way of practical business decisions. Maybe having a partner meant accepting that he had skills and connections I didn't possess. The third sign came when I tried to access our company's financial accounts and discovered that Marcus had changed the banking setup without telling me. It's more efficient this way, he explained when I confronted him. All expenses get approved through me, which helps us maintain better cash flow control and avoid duplicate spending. But I can't even see our current balance, I said. I don't know how much money we have or how much we're spending on what. You get monthly reports with all that information, Marcus said. And obviously, you can ask me anytime you want specific numbers. This just prevents us from accidentally authorizing conflicting expenditures. I want access to the accounts, I said firmly. This is still my company. It's our company, Marcus corrected. And as the partner handling financial operations, I need to maintain oversight of cash flow. But I'll add you as a secondary authorized user so you can view balances and transactions. When I checked the account later that day, I found that Marcus had been spending money on things we'd never discussed. A $20,000 marketing consultant. New office furniture for a company headquarters I'd never agreed to lease. A $50,000 payment to a branding agency for logo and package redesigns. These are necessary investments for scaling up, Marcus explained when I questioned the expenses. You can't grow a business by thinking small and cutting corners on everything. But we never agreed on any of these expenditures, I said. Some of this money is supposed to be for production equipment and raw materials. The grocery store contracts require us to have professional marketing materials and a legitimate business presence, Marcus said. We can't fulfill orders for 200 stores while operating out of a rented kitchen and using packaging that looks homemade. He was right, but something about the way he was right felt wrong. Every decision made sense individually, but collectively they were transforming the company into something I didn't recognize. Something that felt more like Marcus's vision than mine. The fourth sign was the most personal. I arrived at the production facility one morning to find that Marcus had hired a new director of product development without consulting me. Jessica Chin was a food scientist with experience at major packaged food companies, and she'd been brought in to optimize our product line for mass market appeal. I thought I was in charge of product development, I said to Marcus privately. You are, he assured me. Jessica is here to support you, to handle the technical aspects while you focus on the creative vision. But within a week, it became clear that Jessica had been hired to replace me, not support me. She had her own ideas about flavors, nutritional content, and production processes. When we disagreed about something, Marcus consistently sided with her, citing her industry experience and technical expertise. Lena's original formula is a good starting point, Jessica said during a product meeting, but it needs significant refinement for retail success. The protein content creates texture issues at scale, and the natural sweeteners don't provide the flavor consistency that major buyers expect. Those natural sweeteners are why the bars are actually healthy, I said. That's our competitive advantage. Our competitive advantage is market penetration and profit margins, Jessica replied. Health claims are just marketing messages. What matters is creating a product that customers will repeatedly purchase. I watched Marcus nod along with everything Jessica said, and I realized that somewhere in the last 2 months, I'd stopped being the creator of this company and started being just another employee whose opinions could be overruled. That night, I called Mrs. Rodriguez. It sounds like you're being pushed out of your own business, she said after I'd explained what was happening. But the company is more successful than ever, I said. We're about to be in hundreds of stores. We're making more money than I ever imagined. Are you making more money, or is the company making more money? I hadn't thought about it that way, but she was right to ask. With all the new expenses and Marcus's financial control, I hadn't actually seen my personal income increase despite the business growth. Maybe I'm being paranoid, I said. Maybe this is just what it feels like to have a real business partner instead of doing everything myself. Trust your instincts, Mrs. Rodriguez said. If something feels wrong, it probably is wrong. But I was afraid to trust my instincts, because my instincts were telling me that I'd made a terrible mistake. That in my eagerness to grow quickly, I'd given away control of the company I'd built from nothing. That Marcus wasn't trying to help me succeed, he was trying to replace me. The fifth sign was the one that finally forced me to face the truth. I came to the office early one Tuesday morning and overheard Marcus on a phone call in his office. The door was slightly open, and his voice carried clearly into the hallway. The transition is going exactly as planned, he was saying. She's resistant to some of the changes, but she doesn't have the business experience to understand what's necessary for real growth. There was a pause while the other person spoke. No, there won't be any problems with the ownership structure, Marcus continued. The contracts are ironclad, and she's already agreed to every major change we've implemented. By the time we're ready for the next funding round, she'll be grateful for whatever equity position we offer her. My blood went cold. Next funding round? We hadn't discussed raising more investment. And what did he mean about offering me an equity position? I already owned 60% of the company. The energy bar line is just the beginning, Marcus said. Once we have the retail relationships established, we can introduce other products under the brand. Protein shakes, meal replacement bars, maybe even expand into supplements. She created a nice little foundation, but she doesn't have the vision to build something really significant. I backed away from the door quietly, my heart pounding with the realization that I'd been completely played. Marcus wasn't my partner. He was someone who'd identified a small business with potential and was systematically taking control of it while making me feel like I was being helped. But I was trapped. I'd signed contracts giving him significant authority over business operations. I'd agreed to the new facility, the new staff, the new financial structure. Every step of the way, he'd presented his moves as necessary business decisions, and I'd agreed because they'd seemed logical at the time. Now I could see that each agreement had been designed to weaken my position while strengthening his. I still technically owned the majority of the company, but Marcus controlled how it operated day to day. He controlled the money, the relationships, the strategic decisions. I was back to being powerless, just like I'd been at 12 years old outside Romano's family restaurant. The only difference was that this time, I'd walked into the trap willingly, believing that someone was offering to help me when they were actually planning to take everything I'd built. But Marcus Webb had made one crucial mistake in his calculation. He'd assumed that because I'd trusted him once, I'd continue to trust him while he dismantled my company piece by piece. He didn't know that I'd spent 15 years learning exactly what betrayal looked like, and that I'd been preparing for this moment without even realizing it. The war for my company was about to begin. I spent the rest of that morning pretending everything was normal while my mind raced through every conversation, every decision, every contract I'd signed over the past 6 months. By lunch, I'd realized that Marcus hadn't made a single move that wasn't calculated to increase his control while decreasing mine. The new facility? It was leased under terms that required his personal guarantee, making him essential to our operations. The new employees? They'd all been hired through his connections and reported directly to him. The grocery store contracts? They were structured so that Marcus was the primary contact, meaning the relationships belonged to him, not the company. I'd been systematically isolated from my own business without even realizing it was happening. That afternoon, I drove to the office of the lawyer who'd helped me incorporate the business originally. Janet Morrison was a small business attorney who'd worked with dozens of startups, and she'd always been straight with me about legal realities. I need you to review my partnership agreement, I told her, sliding the contracts across her desk. And I need you to tell me exactly what rights I have to make changes to how the company operates. Janet spent an hour reading through the documents, her expression getting more concerned with each page. When she finished, she looked up at me with the kind of face that tells you the news is worse than you feared. Lena, this partnership agreement is heavily weighted in Marcus's favor, she said carefully. He has authority over day-to-day operations, financial decisions, hiring and firing, vendor relationships, and strategic planning. But I own 60%, I said. That has to count for something. You own 60% of the equity, which means you get 60% of any profits distributed and 60% of any sale proceeds. But equity ownership doesn't automatically give you operational control when you've contractually delegated that authority to your partner. The words felt like physical blows. So what can I actually control? Very little, based on these contracts. You have the right to receive financial reports, to approve any sale of the company, and to vote on issuing new shares. But Marcus can essentially run the business however he wants as long as he's not stealing money or deliberately destroying value. What if I want to dissolve the partnership? Janet flipped through the contract again, finding the relevant section. The dissolution clause requires mutual agreement or proof of breach of fiduciary duty. If you try to force dissolution without his agreement, you'd have to buy out his 40% stake at fair market value as determined by an independent appraiser. How much would that cost? Based on your current revenue projections and the grocery store contracts he's negotiated, probably between $2 and $3 million. Money you'd have to raise while he continues controlling the business operations. I left Janet's office feeling like I was drowning. I'd created a successful company from nothing, worked 20-hour days for years to build something valuable, and somehow I'd signed contracts that made me a minority partner in my own business. But the real devastation was still coming. The next morning, I arrived at the office to find Marcus in a meeting with two men in expensive suits. Through the glass conference room wall, I could see them reviewing documents and shaking hands. When the meeting ended, Marcus introduced them as investors from a private equity firm. Lena, I'd like you to meet David Chin and Robert Sullivan from Meridian Capital, Marcus said with that same confident smile. They're interested in providing additional funding to accelerate our growth. Additional funding? I said. We haven't discussed raising more money. We have now, Marcus said. David, Robert, this is Lena Chin, our product developer and minority partner. The way he said minority partner hit me like a slap. 6 months ago, I'd been the sole owner of this company. Now I was being introduced as the junior partner to investors I'd never met. Lena's energy bar formula is the foundation of our success, Marcus continued, but we need serious capital to scale nationally and compete with major brands. David Chin looked at me with polite interest. What's your background in food science? I don't have formal training, I admitted. I developed the products through experimentation and studying nutrition research. Interesting, David said in a tone that clearly meant he found it concerning rather than impressive. Robert Sullivan was more direct. Have you considered bringing in professional product development? The food industry is highly regulated, and scaling requires expertise in manufacturing processes, supply chain management, quality control systems. We actually just hired Jessica Chin as our Director of Product Development, Marcus said. She has 15 years of experience with major food companies. I stood there listening to them discuss my company like I was barely relevant to its future. Every question was directed to Marcus. Every concern was addressed by explaining how he'd already solved it. Every decision was presented as his strategic vision. We're prepared to invest $5 million for a 35% stake, David announced. That would give us significant operational input while allowing the current partners to maintain majority control. 35% of the company for $5 million. It sounded impressive until I did the math. If they were paying $5 million for 35%, that meant they valued the entire company at about $14 million. Marcus's 40% would be worth over $5 million, while my 60% would be worth about $8 million. Except I wouldn't actually be getting any of that money. The investment would go to the company, diluting my ownership percentage while giving Marcus's allies more power to override my decisions. We'll need to review this with our legal team, I said, trying to sound like I had some authority in the discussion. Of course, David said. Marcus has already provided most of the due diligence materials, but we're happy to answer any questions you might have. After the investors left, I confronted Marcus directly. You're selling part of my company without my consent, I said. I'm raising capital to grow our company, Marcus corrected. The partnership agreement gives me authority to pursue funding opportunities that serve the business's best interests. My ownership percentage gets diluted every time you sell more shares. Your absolute ownership decreases, but the value of your stake increases, Marcus said patiently. 60% of a small company is worth less than 45% of a much larger company. 45%? The investors are buying 35%. The investment structure is more complex than that, Marcus said. There are preferred shares, anti-dilution clauses, performance bonuses tied to revenue targets. It's all very standard for this type of growth financing. I felt the ground shifting under my feet again. I want to see the exact terms before anything gets signed. Absolutely, Marcus agreed. But remember that these investors have other opportunities. If we don't move quickly, they'll invest in our competitors instead. That night, I stayed up until 3 a.m. reading investment documents that might as well have been written in a foreign language. Preferred shares that got paid before common shares. Anti-dilution provisions that protected investor ownership percentages, but not mine. Performance clauses that could trigger additional equity transfers if certain revenue targets weren't met. By the time I finished reading, I understood that accepting this investment would reduce my ownership to less than 40% while giving the investors and Marcus combined control over every major decision. I was being bought out of my own company 5% at a time. But the final blow came when I discovered that Marcus had been planning this for months. I found the evidence by accident while looking for production reports in his office. A folder labeled Acquisition Strategy that contained emails, financial projections, and legal memos dating back to before we'd even signed our original partnership agreement. The emails were between Marcus and a business consultant, discussing the best methods for acquiring control of small food companies with growth potential. My company was specifically mentioned as a target, with detailed analysis of my financial situation, my lack of business experience, and the best approaches for gaining my trust. Subject displays classic entrepreneur profile, one memo read. High technical skill, low business sophistication, desperate for growth capital. Standard partnership to acquisition timeline should be 18 to 24 months. Another email outlined the step-by-step process they'd followed. Phase 1. Establish partnership with operational authority. Phase 2. Restructure operations to increase dependency. Phase 3. Bring in professional management to demonstrate subjects' limitations. Phase 4. Introduce growth capital that dilutes subjects' control. Phase 5. Force buyout or marginalize to advisory role. We were currently in Phase 4. The financial projections showed what Marcus expected my company to be worth after the acquisition was complete. Over $50 million within 3 years, based on the retail relationships and product lines he planned to develop. $50 million built on the foundation I'd created, using the formulas I'd developed, in markets I'd helped establish. But none of that money would come to me, because by the time the company reached that value, I'd own less than 5% of it. I printed every document in the folder and drove straight to Janet Morrison's office. This is fraud, I said, spreading the papers across her desk. He lied about his intentions from the beginning. He never planned to be my partner. He planned to steal my company. Janet read through the documents, her expression getting grimmer with each page. This is definitely unethical, she said finally. But proving fraud in court would be extremely difficult. Marcus can argue that he genuinely believed his strategies would benefit both of you financially. But I'm losing control of everything I built. You're losing control because you signed contracts that gave him that authority, Janet said gently. The fact that he planned to use that authority in ways you didn't expect doesn't necessarily constitute legal fraud. So there's nothing I can do? You could try to force dissolution of the partnership, but that would require buying out his stake at current market value. Based on these projections, that would cost at least $5 million. Money I don't have because he controls all the company's finances. Exactly. I left Janet's office with the sickening realization that I was trapped in a legal framework I'd created myself. Every contract I'd signed, every authority I'd delegated, every decision I'd agreed to had been building toward this moment when I discovered that my company no longer belonged to me in any meaningful way. Marcus had played a perfect game. He'd identified exactly what I wanted: growth, success, financial security, and had offered me a path to achieve it that required me to give him everything he needed to take it away from me. That evening, I sat in my apartment staring at bank statements that showed my personal financial situation. I had about $15,000 in savings, a car that was worth maybe $8,000, and some furniture I could sell for a few $100s. Despite building a company that was apparently worth $14 million, I was almost as poor as I'd been in college. Meanwhile, Marcus was living in a house that cost more than most people make in a decade, driving cars that cost more than I'd earned in 2 years, and traveling to business conferences in cities I'd never been able to afford to visit. I thought about Frank DeLuca at Romano's family restaurant, grabbing my arm and throwing me out into the cold because I didn't deserve basic human kindness. I thought about Maria Santos driving away with my savings, leaving me standing in an empty restaurant feeling stupid for trusting someone who'd promised to pay me back. But this was worse than both of those betrayals combined, because this time I'd handed over everything voluntarily. I'd been so desperate to grow quickly, so afraid of staying small and powerless, that I'd given a stranger control over everything I'd built from nothing. I was 26 years old, and I'd just learned that being smart and hardworking wasn't enough if you didn't understand how people with real power actually operated. But as I sat there in my empty apartment, surrounded by the documents that proved how thoroughly I'd been outmaneuvered, I realized something that Marcus probably hadn't considered. He'd assumed that discovering his betrayal would break me, that I'd accept whatever small percentage he was willing to leave me and be grateful for it. He didn't understand that I'd been broken before, and that every time someone had tried to destroy me, I'd come back stronger than they'd expected. Marcus Webb had just made the same mistake that Frank DeLuca and Maria Santos had made. He'd underestimated exactly how far a person could rise when they had nothing left to lose and everything to prove. The real war was about to begin. The investment deal closed on a Tuesday morning in December. I sat in a conference room surrounded by lawyers and executives, watching Marcus sign documents that officially reduced my ownership in my own company to 38%. The investors now owned 35%, Marcus owned 27%, and somehow I'd become the minority partner in a business I'd created from nothing. "Congratulations," David Chen said, shaking Marcus's hand. "We're excited about the growth potential." Nobody congratulated me. Nobody even looked at me during the signing ceremony. I'd become invisible in my own company. The $5 million investment went directly into company accounts that Marcus controlled. Within a week, he'd used it to lease a new headquarters building, hire 6 additional employees, and launch a marketing campaign that featured Jessica Chin as the head of product innovation, with no mention of me anywhere. "We need professional representation for the brand," Marcus explained when I questioned why my name and story had been completely removed from all marketing materials. "The investors want a polished image that appeals to mainstream consumers." "But this is my story," I said. "I created these products. I built this company from my dorm room." "And that's a great story for internal company culture," Marcus replied. "But external marketing needs to focus on quality, consistency, and reliability. Personal stories can make products seem small and amateur." I watched him erase my existence from the company while using my formulas to make deals worth millions of dollars. The energy bars that grocery stores were ordering by the thousands were still based on recipes I developed through years of experimentation. But according to every piece of marketing material, every press release, every investor presentation, they'd been created by a team of professional food scientists led by Jessica Chen. The worst part was that the business was genuinely successful. Revenue was growing faster than I'd ever imagined possible. We were getting orders from grocery chains across 3 states. Food industry magazines were writing articles about our innovative approach to healthy snacking. Marcus had been right about everything. His strategies worked, his connections opened doors, his vision for growth was being realized exactly as he'd planned. Except none of it belonged to me anymore. By February, I was barely involved in day-to-day operations. Marcus had restructured my role to brand heritage consultant, which meant I had no authority over anything but was kept around to provide historical context when needed. I had an office, a salary, and absolutely no power to influence how my company operated. Think of yourself as the company's founder emeritus, Marcus said during one of our monthly check-ins. Your contribution is honored, but the business needs professional management to reach its full potential. I want to leave, I said. I want to sell my shares and start over with something else. That's certainly your right, Marcus agreed. But the shareholder agreement requires that any sale of shares be offered to existing shareholders first, at a price determined by independent appraisal. I'd already looked into this. Getting an independent appraisal would cost $50,000, and the process could take 6 months. Even if the appraisal valued my shares fairly, Marcus and the investors had the right to match any outside offer, meaning I couldn't sell to anyone who might give me a better deal. What would you estimate my shares are worth? I asked. Based on current revenue projections, probably around $2 million, Marcus said. Which is a fantastic return on your original investment of essentially nothing. $2 million sounded like a fortune to someone who'd grown up with nothing. But I knew the company was worth at least $15 million based on our revenue and growth trajectory. My 38% should have been worth over $5 million, not $2 million. The valuation seems low, I said. Valuations for minority stakes in privately held companies are always discounted, Marcus explained. You don't have control over operations, so your shares are worth less than the same percentage would be in a public company. Every conversation with Marcus felt like discovering new ways I'd trapped myself. Every question I asked revealed another clause in contracts I'd signed, another limitation on my options, another reason why I couldn't get fair value for what I'd built. But losing the company wasn't even the worst part of what was happening to me. The stress of watching my life's work being stolen piece by piece was destroying my health. I wasn't sleeping more than 3 or 4 hours a night, and when I did sleep, I had nightmares about being thrown out of restaurants or watching Marcus drive away with everything I owned. I'd lost 15 pounds because I couldn't keep food down. The irony of starving while owning part of a successful food company wasn't lost on me, but my body had stopped responding to hunger the way it used to. Everything tasted like ash, and eating felt like choking. My relationship with David, the coffee shop manager who'd become my boyfriend over the past year, was falling apart because I couldn't stop talking about the business situation. You need to let this go, he said during what would be our last dinner together. You're making yourself sick over something you can't control. It's my company, I said for probably the 100th time. I can't just let it go. It's not your company anymore, David said gently. And holding on to anger about that is killing you. So I should just accept being stolen from? You should accept reality and figure out how to move forward. But I couldn't move forward because moving forward meant admitting that I'd been completely outplayed by someone who'd never intended to be my partner. It meant accepting that all my years of work and sacrifice had been transformed into someone else's success story. David broke up with me the next week, saying he couldn't watch me destroy myself over something that was already lost. Mrs. Rodriguez was the only person who still took my calls, but even she was running out of patience with my situation. You have 2 choices, she said during one of our phone conversations. You can keep fighting this battle you can't win, or you can take whatever money you can get and start building something new. $2 million isn't enough to start over, I said. Not in the food industry, not competing against companies with real resources. $2 million is more than most people ever see, Mrs. Rodriguez replied. You could start smaller, focus on local markets, build something sustainable instead of trying to grow so fast. I don't want to start smaller, I said. I want what's mine. What's yours is whatever you can actually control, Mrs. Rodriguez said. And right now, that's nothing. In March, Marcus made his final move. He called a board meeting to discuss organizational restructuring for optimal efficiency. The investors supported his proposal to eliminate my consulting position and convert my remaining involvement to advisory capacity only. We appreciate Lena's foundational contributions, Marcus said, reading from prepared remarks, but the company has evolved beyond the need for day-to-day input from non-operational stakeholders. What exactly does advisory capacity mean? I asked. You'd attend quarterly meetings to provide historical context and founder perspective, Jessica Chen explained. But you wouldn't be involved in strategic planning or operational decisions. And my salary? The advisory role would be unpaid, Marcus said. But of course, you'd continue receiving any dividend distributions based on your equity percentage. I looked around the conference room at faces that had become familiar over the past year. The investors who'd never seen me as anything more than an obstacle to efficient operations. The employees Marcus had hired who didn't know or care that I'd created the products they were manufacturing. Jessica Chen, who'd been brought in specifically to replace me and who'd done exactly that. I resign, I said, standing up from the table. Effective immediately. We're sorry to hear that, Marcus said, though he didn't sound sorry at all. Should we arrange for the transition of any materials or information you've been managing? There's nothing to transition, I said. You've already taken everything. I walked out of that conference room and never went back to the building that housed my former company. I drove home to my apartment and sat on my couch, staring at walls that felt like they were closing in on me. I was 27 years old, and I just lost control of everything I'd worked for since I was 12. The company I'd built from nothing was worth millions of dollars, but I couldn't access that value without selling my shares at a massive discount to the people who'd stolen it from me. I had about $20,000 in personal savings, no job, no viable business prospects, and a reputation in the local food industry as someone who'd been too naive to protect her own interests. The apartment I'd been so proud to afford when the business was growing suddenly felt too expensive. The car payments that had seemed manageable when I was drawing a salary were now impossible. Everything that had represented my success was about to become a reminder of my failure. That night, I called the landlord and gave notice that I'd be moving out at the end of the month. I called the car loan company and arranged to surrender the vehicle rather than continue payments I couldn't afford. I started selling furniture and electronics to raise cash for basic living expenses. Within 2 weeks, I'd reduced my life to what could fit in a storage unit and an efficiency apartment across town. No car, no furniture beyond a mattress and a folding chair, no possessions that weren't absolutely necessary for survival. I was living like I had in college, except this time I didn't have the hope of building something better. I'd already built something better, and it had been taken away from me by someone who was smarter about business than I was. The efficiency apartment had thin walls, and I could hear my neighbors through the floor and ceiling. A family with young children lived above me, and their footsteps and voices reminded me constantly of the life I'd thought I was building toward. Financial security, maybe someday a family of my own, the kind of stability that let you plan for the future instead of just surviving day to day. But I was back to surviving day to day, and this time it felt worse because I knew what I'd lost. I started having panic attacks in grocery stores, standing in aisles surrounded by products that reminded me of my former business. Energy bars and protein snacks that were competing with formulas I'd developed, sold by companies that had the resources and market presence I'd signed away. The worst moments came when I'd see my former products on store shelves. They still looked familiar, but the packaging had been redesigned with Jessica Chen's improvements, and the ingredient lists had been modified to reduce costs and increase shelf appeal. Everything that had made them genuinely better than competing products had been compromised for the sake of profit margins. I'd stand there in the snack aisle, looking at bars that were technically mine but had been transformed into something I didn't recognize, sold by a company that had erased my existence from its history. By May, I'd burned through most of my savings and was working part-time at a sandwich shop for $12 an hour. The manager was a college kid who didn't know anything about my business background, and I didn't tell him. I just made sandwiches and took orders and tried not to think about how I'd gone from owning a multi-million-dollar company to asking if customers wanted chips with their lunch. The sandwich shop was in a strip mall next to a small gym, and sometimes I'd see people eating my former energy bars after their workouts. Bars that had been created with my recipes, manufactured using processes I'd helped develop, sold through relationships I'd helped establish. But none of that mattered anymore, because I'd signed contracts that gave other people the right to everything I'd built. One evening in June, I was closing the sandwich shop when a familiar car pulled into the parking lot. Marcus stepped out, wearing an expensive suit and the confident expression of someone whose plans had worked out exactly as intended. He walked into the shop just as I was wiping down the counter. "Lena," he said, sounding genuinely surprised to see me. "I heard you were working here, but I didn't believe it." "What do you want, Marcus?" "I was actually hoping to talk to you," he said. "We're considering a buyout offer for your remaining shares. The investors think it would simplify the ownership structure." "How much?" $1.2 million, Marcus said. "Which is actually above market rate for a minority stake with no operational control. $1.2 million for shares in a company that I'd created and that was now worth over $20 million. It was highway robbery disguised as generosity." "I'll think about it," I said. "Don't think too long," Marcus warned. "The offer won't stay open indefinitely." After he left, I sat in the empty sandwich shop calculating how long I could survive on $12 an hour versus what $1.2 million could do for my future. It was enough to live modestly for years, maybe enough to start something small and local that couldn't be stolen from me. But taking Marcus's offer felt like admitting that he'd won completely, that my years of work were worth whatever he decided to pay me. That night, I walked through my old neighborhood, past the building where my former company was now headquartered. Through the windows, I could see people working late, building something valuable using the foundation I'd created. I stood on the sidewalk looking up at those lit windows, feeling exactly like I had at 12 years old outside Romano's family restaurant. Powerless, invisible, dismissed by people who had what I needed and didn't care what happened to me. Except this time, the people inside had stolen what they had from me. And this time, I was old enough and smart enough to do something about it. Standing outside that building, staring up at the company that used to be mine, I felt something shift inside me. Maybe it was finally hitting rock bottom hard enough to bounce back, or maybe it was realizing that I'd been approaching this whole situation wrong from the beginning. I'd been thinking like a victim, trying to get back what had been taken from me. But Marcus had taught me something valuable, even if he hadn't meant to. He'd shown me exactly how someone with resources and connections could identify opportunities and systematically acquire them. What if I stopped trying to fight him for my old company and started building something that could compete with him instead? The next morning, I called in sick to the sandwich shop and spent the day in the public library, researching everything I could find about the food industry. Not just energy bars, but the entire landscape of where the market was heading, what trends were emerging, what gaps existed that larger companies weren't filling. I found something interesting. While big food companies were focused on scaling existing products for mass retail, there was a growing market for premium, locally sourced foods sold directly to consumers. Farmers markets, specialty stores, online sales platforms that let small producers compete without needing massive distribution networks. The same internet that had made it possible for huge companies to dominate markets was also making it possible for small companies to find customers without going through traditional retail gatekeepers. I spent 3 days reading everything I could find about direct-to-consumer food businesses, subscription services, online marketing strategies. Companies that were generating millions in revenue by selling directly to customers who cared about quality and authenticity rather than just convenience and price. But reading about opportunities and having the resources to pursue them were completely different things. I had about $3,000 to my name, no credit history that would qualify me for business loans, and a recent track record of losing control of my own company. That's when I met Elena Vasquez. I was working my shift at the sandwich shop on a Friday afternoon when a woman in her 50s came in looking frustrated and exhausted. She ordered a turkey sandwich and coffee, then sat down at one of our small tables with a stack of papers and a calculator. After about 20 minutes, I noticed she was crying quietly while staring at the documents. I'd learned to recognize the signs of someone dealing with financial crisis because I'd been living it myself for months. "Are you okay?" I asked during a lull between customers. "Just trying to figure out how to save my restaurant," Elena said, wiping her eyes. "Sorry, I know this isn't the place for personal problems." "What kind of restaurant?" "Family Mexican food," she said. "My grandmother's recipes, been in our family for 3 generations. But the rent went up, suppliers are charging more, and customers are eating less often because of the economy." I looked at her papers and saw financial statements that told a familiar story. A business with good products and loyal customers that was struggling because expenses were growing faster than revenue. "How long have you been operating?" I asked. 15 years in the current location," Elena said. "But we're 3 months behind on rent, and the landlord is starting eviction proceedings." Something about her situation reminded me of my own, except Elena was fighting to keep something that actually belonged to her instead of trying to get back something that had been stolen. "Would you mind if I looked at your numbers?" I asked. "I have some experience with food business finances." Elena hesitated, then spread her financial statements across the table. At this point, I'll take advice from anyone who knows more than I do. I spent my break analyzing her situation, and what I found was both discouraging and hopeful. Elena's food costs were too high because she was buying ingredients in small quantities from expensive suppliers. Her labor costs were unsustainable because she was trying to do everything herself instead of training employees to handle routine tasks. Her marketing budget was basically zero, so she was dependent on walk-in traffic and word of mouth. But her food was genuinely excellent, her customer reviews were outstanding, and her location had great visibility and foot traffic. The problems were operational, not fundamental. "You're not failing because your business is bad," I told her. "You're failing because you're running it like a hobby instead of a business." "I don't know how to run it any other way," Elena said. "My grandmother taught me to cook, not to manage supply chains and marketing budgets." "What if someone helped you with the business side while you focused on the food?" Elena looked at me with the kind of hope that people have when they're drowning and someone throws them a rope. "Do you know someone who could do that?" "Maybe," I said. "Let me think about it." That night, I couldn't stop thinking about Elena's restaurant and the opportunity it represented. She had something authentic and valuable that was failing because of poor business management. I had business skills and knowledge about the food industry, but no resources to start my own company. What if we worked together? I spent the weekend developing a business plan for Elena's restaurant. I researched wholesale food suppliers who could reduce her ingredient costs by 30%. I identified operational changes that could cut her labor costs while improving service quality. I outlined marketing strategies that could double her customer base within 6 months. By Monday morning, I had a proposal that could transform Elena's struggling restaurant into a profitable business. "I want to partner with you," I told her when she came in for lunch. "You handle the food, I handle the business operations. We split the profits 50-50 after expenses." "I can't afford to pay you," Elena said. "I can barely afford to pay rent." "You don't pay me anything up front," I said. "I only make money if the restaurant makes money." If my strategies don't work, you don't owe me anything. Elena read through my business plan, her expression changing from skepticism to excitement as she saw the specific steps I'd outlined. This could actually work, she said. But why would you want to partner with a failing restaurant instead of starting your own business? Because you have something I need, I said. You have recipes that customers love, a location that works, and 15 years of reputation in this community. I have business skills but no resources to start from scratch. And if it works, we both benefit. If it works, we both build something valuable that no one can take away from us. Elena and I shook hands that afternoon, creating a partnership based on complementary skills and shared risk rather than one person having power over the other. The next morning, I gave notice at the sandwich shop and threw myself into transforming Elena's restaurant with the same intensity I'd once put into building my energy bar company. But this time, I was doing it with complete transparency and legal protection. Elena and I signed a partnership agreement that gave us equal authority over all major decisions. We opened a joint business account that required both signatures for any withdrawal over $500. We documented every expense, every change, every strategy so that neither of us could claim sole credit for success or blame the other for failure. Within 2 weeks, we'd renegotiated her supplier contracts and reduced food costs by 28%. I'd implemented inventory management systems that eliminated waste and ensured consistent availability of popular items. We'd trained 2 part-time employees to handle prep work and basic cooking, freeing Elena to focus on menu development and customer service. The transformation was immediate and dramatic. Elena's stress levels dropped as the business systems started working properly. Customer wait times decreased as operations became more efficient. Food quality improved as Elena had more time to focus on preparation instead of scrambling to handle every task herself. But the real breakthrough came when I convinced Elena to start offering catering services for local businesses and events. I've never done catering, Elena said when I first suggested it. You've been cooking for large groups your entire life, I pointed out. Catering is just cooking for groups that aren't sitting in your restaurant. I used my knowledge of local business networks to identify companies that regularly ordered lunch for meetings and events. I created marketing materials that showcased Elena's authentic Mexican cuisine and competitive pricing. I developed systems for taking orders, preparing food in advance, and delivering everything on time. Within a month, we were generating more revenue from catering than from the restaurant itself. Companies loved having access to authentic, high-quality Mexican food for their events, and Elena loved cooking for people who appreciated her grandmother's recipes. But more importantly, we were building something that belonged to both of us equally, something that neither of us could lose to a more sophisticated business partner. By October, Elena's restaurant was not only profitable but expanding. We were discussing opening a second location and maybe developing a line of packaged salsas and sauces for retail sale. I was making more money than I'd earned at the sandwich shop, but more importantly, I was learning that it was possible to build a successful business based on genuine partnership rather than one person exploiting another's trust. Elena and I had created something that Marcus had never offered me, a relationship where both partners benefited from each other's success instead of one partner systematically acquiring control over everything valuable. But working with Elena also reminded me every day of what I'd lost and why I'd lost it. Every successful strategy we implemented was knowledge I'd gained from building my first company, knowledge that Marcus was now using to generate millions of dollars in revenue from formulas I'd developed. One evening in November, while Elena and I were closing the restaurant after a particularly busy day, she asked me something that had apparently been on her mind for a while. "What happened with your energy bar company?" she said. "You've mentioned that you used to own a food business, but you've never told me the whole story." I told her everything. About Marcus and the partnership agreement and the investors who'd helped push me out. About watching my life's work get transformed into someone else's success story while I lost control of everything I'd built. Elena listened without interrupting, her expression getting angrier as I explained how systematically I'd been manipulated and betrayed. "That's theft," she said when I finished. "Maybe not illegal theft, but moral theft." "The contracts were legal," I said. "I signed everything voluntarily." "You signed them because he lied about his intentions," Elena said. "Just because someone uses legal methods doesn't make what they did right. But there's nothing I can do about it now. Even if I could prove fraud, fighting it in court would cost more money than I'd ever recover." Elena was quiet for a long time, wiping down tables and putting away chairs. Finally, she looked up at me with the kind of determination I'd seen in her eyes when we'd first started working together. "What if you didn't try to get your old company back?" she said. "What if you built something bigger and better, something that could compete with Marcus directly?" "With what resources?" "He has millions in investment capital and distribution deals with major retailers." "He has all that because he stole it from you," Elena said. "But you're the one who actually knows how to build something from nothing. He just knows how to take what other people build." She was right, but building something that could compete with a multi-million-dollar company seemed impossible with the resources we had available. "I keep thinking about your energy bars," Elena continued. "The original ones, before Marcus changed all the formulas. What if you developed new products that were even better? What if you built a brand around authenticity and quality instead of mass market appeal?" "The energy bar market is dominated by huge companies now. We couldn't compete on price or distribution." "So don't compete on price and distribution," Elena said. "Compete on being genuine. Tell the real story about who created what and why. Let customers choose between supporting authentic small businesses or buying from companies that steal other people's work." That night, I lay awake thinking about Elena's suggestion. What if I stopped trying to get back what Marcus had stolen and started building something completely new? Something that used everything I'd learned from both my success and my failure? I had knowledge about food science, business operations, and customer preferences that most entrepreneurs would kill for. I had a partner who understood authentic cuisine and quality ingredients. I had hard-earned wisdom about protecting myself from people who wanted to exploit my work. Most importantly, I had something that Marcus would never have, a genuine story of overcoming adversity that customers could connect with emotionally. The next morning, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to build a food company that could not only compete with Marcus, but destroy him. I was going to use every strategy he'd taught me, every connection I developed, every lesson I'd learned from watching him operate. But I was going to do it honestly, with a real partner, building something that could never be stolen because it would belong to people who actually created it. Marcus Webb had made a crucial mistake when he'd taken my company. He'd assumed that destroying me would eliminate the threat I posed to his success. Instead, he just taught me exactly how to destroy him. The war was about to begin, and this time, I knew the rules. It took Elena and me 18 months to build something that could compete with Marcus directly. We called it Abuela's Kitchen, and it was everything my original energy bar company should have been: authentic, transparent, and genuinely focused on creating healthy food that people could trust. We started with Elena's grandmother's traditional Mexican recipes, but I applied everything I'd learned about nutrition science to create products that were both delicious and genuinely healthy. Energy bars made with traditional ingredients like amaranth and chia seeds. Protein balls sweetened with agave and packed with nuts and dried fruits. Breakfast bars that tasted like Elena's grandmother's cookies, but provided balanced nutrition for people with busy lives. The difference between Abuela's Kitchen and my original company was that everything we built was designed to be theft-proof. Elena and I owned exactly 50% each, with ironclad legal agreements that prevented either of us from diluting the other's ownership. We maintained complete control over all operational decisions, financial accounts, and strategic planning. No outside investors, no partners with hidden agendas, no contracts that could be used against us. We sold directly to consumers through farmers markets, online orders, and subscription services. We built relationships with small local stores and coffee shops that valued authentic products over mass-market brands. We told our real story, Elena's family recipes combined with my food science background, created by people who actually cared about the quality of what they were making. By our second year, we were generating over $2 million in annual revenue and growing by 30% every quarter. We'd hired 12 employees, all of whom received profit-sharing bonuses and were treated like family rather than disposable labor. We developed loyal customers who bought our products not just because they tasted good, but because they believed in what we represented. But more importantly, we'd proven that authentic small businesses could thrive by being genuine rather than just being profitable. The success of Abuela's Kitchen had given me something I'd lost when Marcus stole my first company, confidence that I could build valuable things that belonged to me. But it had also given me the resources and credibility to do something I'd been planning for 2 years. I was ready to destroy Marcus Webb's reputation and everything he'd built on stolen foundations. The opportunity came in March, when the Regional Food Industry Association announced their annual conference and awards ceremony. Marcus's company, which he'd renamed Meridian Nutrition, was nominated for Business Innovation of the Year for their successful expansion into national retail markets. The irony was perfect. Marcus was being honored for building a successful company using strategies and products that he'd stolen from me, at an event attended by every important person in the regional food industry. I registered Abuela's Kitchen as a vendor for the conference's trade show component, which gave Elena and me access to the main event and networking sessions. But more importantly, it gave me the opportunity to address a room full of food industry executives and investors who needed to know exactly how Marcus Webb conducted business. I spent weeks preparing for that conference like I was preparing for war. I gathered every document from the acquisition strategy folder I'd found in Marcus's office. I compiled evidence of how he'd systematically lied about his intentions, manipulated contract terms, and stolen my company through legal but fraudulent means. But I also gathered evidence of something even more damaging, Marcus's pattern of doing this to other entrepreneurs. Using the business connections I developed through Abuela's Kitchen, I tracked down 3 other people who'd had experiences similar to mine with Marcus. A woman who'd invented a line of organic baby foods that Marcus had acquired and then pushed her out of. A man who'd developed innovative packaging technology that Marcus had claimed as his own intellectual property. A couple who'd created a successful catering business that Marcus had systematically destroyed after they refused to sell to him. All of them had been told they weren't sophisticated enough to handle business growth. All of them had signed contracts that gave Marcus more control than they'd understood. All of them had watched him take credit for their innovations while erasing their contributions from the company history. Marcus Webb wasn't just a businessman who'd made questionable decisions with my company. He was a predator who specialized in identifying vulnerable entrepreneurs and systematically stealing their life's work. The night before the conference, Elena and I sat in our hotel room reviewing everything I planned to present. "Are you sure you want to do this?" she asked. "Once you make these accusations public, there's no taking them back." "I'm not making accusations," I said. "I'm presenting facts." Marcus documented his own strategies in emails and memos. He can't deny evidence that he created himself. But what if it backfires? What if people think you're just a bitter ex-partner trying to damage his reputation? "Then at least I'll have tried," I said. "And at least everyone in this industry will know what kind of person they're dealing with when they work with Marcus Webb." The conference started with a trade show where vendors could display their products and network with industry professionals. Elena and I had designed our booth to tell the story of Abuela's Kitchen through both product samples and educational materials about authentic food production. We were busy with customers when I saw Marcus walking through the trade show with David Chin and Robert Sullivan, the investors who'd helped push me out of my original company. They were touring vendor booths, probably looking for their next acquisition target. Marcus spotted our booth from across the aisle, and I watched his expression change from casual interest to shock to something that looked like concern. He said something to his companions and started walking toward us. Lena, he said when he reached our booth, putting on the same confident smile I remembered from our partnership meetings. I heard you'd started something new. Congratulations on your success. Thank you, I said evenly. We're proud of what we've built. Marcus tried some of our products, nodding appreciatively. These are excellent. Very authentic flavors. You've always had great instincts for product development. Yes, I have, I said. It's one of the skills that made my first company so valuable. Well, good luck with everything, Marcus said, clearly wanting to end the conversation and move away. Actually, I'm glad you stopped by, I said. I'm giving a presentation this afternoon about successful partnerships in the food industry. I think you'd find it very educational. Marcus's smile faltered slightly. I'm sure it would be interesting, but I have other commitments. That's too bad, I said. I was planning to use our partnership as a case study in how business relationships can go wrong when one partner isn't honest about their intentions. Marcus stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him calculating whether I was bluffing or if I actually had something damaging to present. I think there might be some misunderstandings about how our partnership ended, he said carefully. No misunderstandings, I replied. I have documentation of everything. Marcus left our booth without another word, but I could see him making phone calls as he walked away. I had no doubt that he was trying to figure out exactly what evidence I had and how much damage I could do to his reputation. The afternoon presentation session was held in the conference's main ballroom, with about 300 industry professionals in attendance. I'd been given a 20-minute slot to present on building authentic food businesses in a corporate marketplace. Elena introduced me, explaining how we'd built Abuela's Kitchen from a struggling single restaurant to a thriving multi-product company. Then I took the stage, looking out at an audience that included some of the most influential people in the regional food industry. Marcus was sitting in the back row with his investors, probably hoping to gauge how seriously he needed to take whatever I was about to say. 2.5 years ago, I owned a successful energy bar company that I'd built from nothing. I began. I was generating significant revenue, had contracts with major retailers, and was positioned for rapid growth. Today, I don't own any part of that company, despite having created every product and established every business relationship it was built on. I had the audience's attention immediately. Business theft wasn't something that usually got discussed openly at industry conferences. I lost my company because I trusted a business partner who told me he wanted to help me grow, when he actually intended to systematically acquire control of everything valuable I'd built. This person used legal contracts and industry standard agreements to steal my life's work while making it appear that I was being helped rather than exploited. I clicked to my first slide, which showed Marcus's photo and the name of his current company. Marcus Webb approached me with promises of partnership, investment, and shared success. What he delivered was a carefully planned acquisition strategy designed to transfer ownership of my company to himself and his investors while leaving me with minimal compensation and no operational control. The room had gone completely quiet. People were looking back and forth between me and Marcus, trying to understand exactly what was being alleged. I'm not here to complain about losing a business dispute, I continued. I'm here to present evidence that Marcus Webb operates a systematic scheme to identify successful small food businesses, gain the owner's trust through partnership offers, and then use legal manipulation to steal those businesses for himself and his investors. I clicked through slides that showed excerpts from the acquisition strategy folder, with Marcus's name and company information clearly visible on the documents. These are emails and planning documents that Marcus created, detailing his strategy for acquiring control of my company. As you can see, he refers to me as the subject and outlines a timeline for systematically reducing my ownership percentage until I could be forced out entirely. The audience was riveted now, reading the projected documents that showed Marcus's calculated plan for stealing my business. I could see people in the audience turning to look at Marcus, who was staring straight ahead with no expression on his face. But I'm not the only entrepreneur Marcus has targeted, I continued. I've identified 3 other cases where he used identical strategies to acquire control of innovative food businesses created by other people. I introduced Sarah Martinez, Tom Williams, and Janet and Carlos Rodriguez, the other entrepreneurs who'd agreed to speak about their experiences with Marcus. Each of them took a few minutes to describe how Marcus had approached them, gained their trust, and then systematically stolen their businesses using the same legal manipulation techniques he'd used on me. By the time all 4 of us had presented our evidence, the pattern was undeniable. Marcus Webb wasn't a successful entrepreneur who'd built multiple businesses. He was a predator who specialized in stealing other people's work and claiming credit for their innovations. The reason I'm presenting this information, I concluded, is not revenge against Marcus Webb. It's protection for every entrepreneur in this room who might someday be approached by someone offering partnership when they actually intend acquisition. It's education about how legal contracts can be used to steal businesses from the people who create them. I clicked to my final slide, which showed Abuela's Kitchen's revenue growth and customer satisfaction ratings. The good news is that authentic businesses built on genuine partnerships can not only survive this kind of theft, they can thrive by being better than the companies that steal from them. Elena and I have built something that belongs to us completely, that can never be taken away by people who mistake legal manipulation for business skill. The applause when I finished was immediate and sustained. People were standing up, both to clap and to get a better look at Marcus, who is now the most notorious person in the room. But the real damage came during the networking session after the presentations. I watched Marcus try to engage in conversations with industry professionals who now knew exactly how he'd built his success. People who had been friendly with him that morning were avoiding eye contact and cutting conversations short. Potential business partners were suddenly unavailable for meetings. Vendors who had been eager to work with his company were politely declining his approaches. David Chin and Robert Sullivan, the investors who'd helped Marcus steal my company, spent the networking session having intense conversations with legal and financial advisors. I could see them calculating the reputational and financial damage that would result from being publicly associated with systematic business theft. But the most satisfying moment came when Marcus finally approached me directly. "You've destroyed my reputation," he said, his composure finally cracking. "Everything I've built is going to collapse because of your presentation." "Everything you built was stolen from other people," I replied. "I just made sure everyone knew where it actually came from." "Those contracts were legal," Marcus said. "Everything I did was documented and approved by lawyers." "Legal and ethical aren't the same thing," I said. "You used legal methods to steal businesses from people who trusted you. The fact that it was technically legal doesn't make it right." "You'll never prove fraud in court," Marcus said. "All those contracts will hold up under legal scrutiny." "I don't need to prove fraud in court," I said. "I just needed to prove your character to the people you do business with. And based on what I'm seeing today, that mission has been accomplished." Marcus stared at me with the kind of hatred that comes from someone who's been completely outmaneuvered. For 2 years, he'd probably assumed that I'd accepted my loss and moved on with my life. He'd never expected me to build something successful enough to challenge him publicly. "This isn't over," he said. "Yes, it is," I replied. "You can't steal from people anymore because everyone knows what you do. Your investors are going to distance themselves because association with you is now a liability. Your current business partnerships are going to dissolve because no one wants to work with someone who steals from entrepreneurs. And what do you get out of destroying me?" "Justice," I said. "And protection for every entrepreneur who might have been your next victim." Marcus walked away without another word, and I never saw him again. Within 3 months, Meridian Nutrition lost its major retail contracts as companies decided they didn't want to be associated with Marcus's business practices. The investors pulled out, forcing Marcus to sell the company's assets to pay off debts. The energy bar formulas I developed ended up being acquired by a legitimate food company that gave me proper credit for their creation. Marcus Webb's reputation in the food industry was completely destroyed, and he eventually moved to another state where people didn't know his history. But the real victory wasn't watching Marcus's empire collapse. It was watching Abuela's Kitchen continue to grow based on authentic value rather than stolen innovations. Elena and I had built something that no one could take away from us, something that proved authentic partnership could create more value than exploitation ever could. I'd gotten my revenge, but more importantly, I'd gotten my life back. 3 years after the conference presentation that destroyed Marcus Webb's reputation, Elena and I were running a food empire that we could barely have imagined when we'd first shaken hands in that sandwich shop. Abuela's Kitchen had grown from a single struggling restaurant to a company with 12 retail locations, a thriving online business, and product lines in over 500 stores across the country. But more importantly, we'd built it the right way. Every employee was a profit-sharing partner. Every business decision was made transparently with input from people who would be affected by it. Every product we created honored both Elena's family traditions and my commitment to genuine nutrition science. I was 31 years old, financially secure for the first time in my life, and surrounded by people who valued authenticity over exploitation. Elena had become more than a business partner. She was the sister I'd never had, someone who understood both my ambitions and my fears. The success of Abuela's Kitchen had also opened doors I'd never expected. I'd been invited to speak at business schools about ethical entrepreneurship. Food Network had featured our story in a documentary about authentic family businesses. I'd even been approached by publishers who wanted me to write a book about building businesses that couldn't be stolen. But despite all this success, there was still something unfinished in my story. A circle that needed to be closed before I could truly move forward with complete peace. Romano's family restaurant was for sale. I'd learned about it through Elena, who'd heard from other restaurant owners that Frank DeLuca was retiring and looking for a buyer. The restaurant had struggled in recent years, hurt by competition from newer establishments and Frank's resistance to updating his business model for changing customer preferences. "You should buy it," Elena said when she told me the news. "Turn it into something beautiful." "I don't need another restaurant," I said. "We're already growing faster than we can manage." "This isn't about business," Elena said. "This is about healing that 12-year-old girl who got thrown out into the cold." She was right, but I wasn't sure I was ready to face Frank DeLuca again. Even after all my success, the memory of that night still had the power to make me feel small and powerless. But Elena wouldn't let it go. What if that little girl could see you walk back into that restaurant as the owner? What if Frank DeLuca had to treat you with respect because you controlled his future instead of him controlling yours? The idea was both terrifying and compelling. Going back to Romano's would mean confronting the moment that had shaped everything about how I approached the world. It would mean facing the man who'd taught me that people without money didn't deserve basic human kindness. I drove by the restaurant on a Thursday evening, parking across the street and watching customers come and go. The building looked smaller than I remembered, shabbier around the edges. The parking lot needed repaving, and several of the exterior lights were burned out. But through the windows, I could see families eating together, just like I'd seen 19 years earlier when I was hungry and desperate and afraid. The warmth and light that had drawn me as a child were still there, but now they represented something different. Not a place that had rejected me, but a place where I could create the kind of welcome I'd needed back then. I called the realtor the next morning. Romano's was priced at $485,000, which included the building, equipment, and existing business operations. It wasn't expensive compared to what Elena and I were generating from our other locations, but it represented something much more valuable than money. It represented the power to rewrite history. The realtor arranged for me to tour the property on a Monday afternoon when the restaurant was closed. Walking through the dining room where I'd been humiliated felt surreal. The same heavy carpet, the same layout of tables and booths, even the same hostess stand where I'd first asked for help. But now I was the one with power. I was the one who could decide what happened to this place and everyone who worked here. Frank DeLuca was there to answer questions about the business operations, though he clearly didn't recognize me. Why would he? I'd been a scrawny, dirty 12-year-old when he'd thrown me out. Now I was a successful businesswoman in a tailored suit, accompanied by lawyers and accountants. The restaurant has been profitable for most of its 35 years, Frank explained as we walked through the kitchen. Loyal customer base, established supplier relationships, trained staff who've been here for years. What about growth potential? I asked, studying the equipment and layout with the analytical eye I'd developed through years of restaurant operations. There's always room for growth, Frank said. But I've kept things traditional. Customers know what to expect when they come to Romano's. I nodded, making notes about improvements that could increase efficiency and profitability. But I was also studying Frank himself, looking for signs of the man who'd grabbed my arm and thrown me onto the sidewalk for having the audacity to ask for food. He was older now, probably in his 70s, with gray hair and the stooped posture of someone who'd spent decades on his feet in restaurant kitchens. He looked tired, maybe a little sad about ending the business that had been his life's work. But he also looked exactly like the kind of person who would see a hungry child as a problem to be removed rather than a human being who needed help. I'll need to review the financial records, I said. But I'm definitely interested in making an offer. Great, Frank said. I'm hoping to find a buyer who'll respect what we've built here. This place has been my life for over 3 decades. I understand the importance of preserving what works while updating what doesn't, I said. I own several restaurants, so I know how to honor tradition while improving operations. Frank looked relieved to hear that I had restaurant experience. Too many buyers these days want to change everything, turn family places into trendy concepts that lose their soul. I believe in authentic food served in welcoming environments, I said. Places where everyone feels valued and respected. That was as close as I came to hinting at my real identity, but Frank didn't pick up on the significance of my words. 2 weeks later, I submitted an offer for the full asking price with no contingencies. Frank accepted immediately, probably relieved that he wouldn't have to negotiate with multiple buyers or worry about deals falling through. The closing was scheduled for the following month, which gave me time to plan exactly how I wanted to handle the transition. The day we signed the papers, I sat across from Frank at a conference table surrounded by lawyers and real estate agents. He was signing documents that transferred ownership of his life's work to someone he still didn't recognize as the child he'd once thrown away.